us today, Donal.
Thank you. Good morning. Now, I've chosen just a limited number of issues to raise this morning. Okay, thank you. I'm going to focus on aquatic ecosystems that are unsatisfactory and need to be improved by utilising what I'm calling the right measure in the right place approach Mary mentioned earlier. Now, one of the challenges of achieving the right measure in the right place is the tendency for siloed approaches, because there are a wide variety of relevant organisations involved, all with their own separate responsibilities and KPIs, and not always with enough collaboration between them. And allied to that then, of course, you have the different disciplines. Now, the statement by James Lovelock there might be a little bit strong, but I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration between the different disciplines. And if our environmental outcomes are to be achieved, there's going to be a lot more contact between them. The boundaries between them are going to need to be a lot more permeable. Okay, let's come up with some solutions then. Well, the first one I'm suggesting is the vision that we have of our planet. And this is the vision of the Forum Ishka in their framework for integrated land and landscape management. And the reason that they've produced this picture on the right there is that all the components of our natural environment, they're interrelated, interlinked, and above all, they're interdependent. So we can't just take biodiversity out on its own. It's interlinked with those other components there. And so to protect aquatic biodiversity, management of these components must be undertaken in a cohesive, holistic and integrated manner. Now, easier said than done. So how can we do this? Well, we need to take catchments as our system. And the reason is that catchments are the land-based units for water and aquatic ecosystem management. But they're unique. Think of North County Dublin here. Compare that with Connemara or with the Golden Vale. So that means we need to understand the physical settings in the catchments and the connections between water, ecosystems and human activities. So if catchments are the appropriate system we should be using, well then what scientific approach is needed? Well, logic says it needs to be catchment science. And catchment science starts with scientists' own disciplines. And
Sorry, we've lost your
no, I see, yeah, it's on my screen, all right.
There we are.
I must have hit something. It starts with our own discipline. In my case, it was hydrogeology. And I realised after many years that I needed to learn from and collaborate with biologists, with engineers, agricultural scientists and others to be more effective in contributing to water management in my work. So based on that experience, I suggest that all the scientists who have a role in aquatic biodiversity management need to think like and act like catchment scientists. Now, what I'm going to do now is take just one of the pressures. I'm sorry, I must be.
Don't get that. Just take a moment. Is that right?
Run a bit further.
Okay, there's
I'm going to take one of the main, I think I'll stand back a bit from it just in case my moving around is fine. One of the main pressures, which is agricultural activities. I'm just going to take two of the pollutants of concern, phosphate and nitrate. But before discussing those, I'm going to just draw your attention to the importance of the physical settings in catchments. And the map on the right there shows you the drainage characteristics. Just three categories, really. The freely draining setting, that's where nitrate can arise from. In the poorly draining mineral setting, that's where phosphate and sediment will arise. So quite contrasting situations. And thankfully, we have maps showing where they arise. This is a map produced by the Catchments Unit in the EPA. The blue area there is where phosphorus and sediment are arising from farming and impacting on water quality and biodiversity. The brown area is the free draining area down the south and southeast mainly, where nitrate is impacting on aquatic ecosystems. To talk a little bit about phosphate, one of the issues with phosphate is that tiny losses to water are sufficient to impact on aquatic biodiversity. So less than 50% of the typical phosphate load that farmers would apply, less than that, can cause an impact on water quality. So you can imagine how difficult it is to prevent that sort of small loss. And that's why one of the key measures is to intercept the phosphate as it runs off before reaching streams and drainage ditches. Now, the Good Agricultural Practices regulations are the main regulation for dealing with pollutants arising from farming, but they have fixed width buffer zones, either 2 meters or 5 meters. And these are inadequate to intercept phosphate in many poorly draining areas. And you see 3 of them there. The one in the middle, I just took that photograph just 2 weeks ago. You see the water running off there, brown, and that would have phosphate in it. But so the phosphate, the photos show water containing phosphate and sediment from large fields, all focusing into one area. Now, in a situation like that, as you can see there on the left, the 2 meter width that's required is inadequate to stop the phosphate and sediment getting into water. And that's where you need spatially targeted buffers. In other words, targeted on those zones where the water is flowing into the streams. And they need to be extended because the 2 meters and the 5 meters are inadequate. With something like this, an extended buffer, and this could be planted with trees, for instance. Now, since I did this presentation, I think you probably know that there's been a 1.3 billion money now going to be provided for planting trees. But it's absolutely crucial, if we are to mitigate phosphate and sediment runoff, that these trees are planted in the right place. In other words, in these zones where the water is running off. And I suppose, in addition then, an advantage of this is that it provides the opportunity to pay farmers for the environmental services and public goods that they provide. Nitrate is more difficult to deal with. The areas in purple there are the areas where nitrate is arising. There are free draining areas. What happens is that the nitrate leaches down through the soil into groundwater, flows into streams. Now, usually doesn't have a big impact on the biodiversity of the streams, but once that nitrate reaches the estuarine water bodies, it causes an impact there. And all those water bodies along the south coast are not achieving their required objective. They're unsatisfactory. But the challenge with nitrogen, though, is that the nutrient use efficiency is less than 30%. In other words, if you apply 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, only 60 kilograms is taken off as milk and meat, leaving 140 then to go to either to air or down to groundwater, and then in potentially into estuaries. So farmers are doing quite a bit at the moment to try and reduce the amount of leaching. They're using protected urea, liming the soil, low emission slurry spreading. That's beneficial, but I feel that there are circumstances where you need a big load reduction and there isn't going to be sufficient reduction, I feel, without reducing perhaps animal numbers. So just to talk about the GAP, the Good Agricultural Practice Regulation, they're the main regulation for preventing pollution of water. Farm inspections are the means used to ensure compliance, but they're one-size-fits-all regulation, and inevitably they have to be. And therefore inspections are not an adequate means generally on their own for restoring our ecosystems to being satisfactory. Now, but with regard to the inspections, they need to be improved. They need to be risk-based and targeted. But thankfully, based on recent progress in catchment characterisation, the EPA are developing a risk-based approach for inspections. And this is a key development But all inspections now need to follow that approach. But inspections on their own are not going to be sufficient, in my view. Without the involvement and cooperation and co-ownership of water management by farmers, our water quality and associated aquatic biodiversity objectives will not be achieved in the foreseeable future, which means, I feel, a lot more getting the farmers more involved in this, creating a positive and constructive atmosphere towards environmental management, paying properly for environmental services, for instance, but still using inspections. We still need inspections because there are a proportion of farmers who are allowing runoff and causing water pollution problems. So just to summarise then, we need an adequate number of scientists and farm advisors trained and working as catchment scientists. We need to provide technical assistance to farmers at times as well. They may need technical assistance. And again, there needs to be provision of adequate payments. And lastly then, just general suggestions, collaboration and linkages between organisations and disciplines are needed. There is good collaboration between the catchment unit, local authorities water programme, Teagasc advisors, but the wildlife service staff need to get more involved in this area. They haven't had the staff in the past, now they do, and they need to be contributing as well. And lastly, just to say, all measures undertaken need to have a focus on environmental outcomes with projected dates for achievement of the outcomes. Okay.